the purpose of an organization is to help ordinary people do extraordinary things. When I think about Drucker's principle of that, I think about the possibilities of work, the genius, the people that we hire in, the hopes and dreams when they come into workplaces, what they're expecting. How do we continue to tap into that? How do we grow that? And how do we measure that in terms of the success of the organizations?
This is Doing the Right Things Well, a podcast that features conversations with leaders of America's best managed companies. I'm your host, Michael Kelly, the Executive Director of the Drucker Institute at Claremont Graduate University. The Institute is home to nearly a century of research on modern management thinking by Peter F. Drucker and those he inspired. For nearly a decade, we have published a ranking of America's best managed publicly traded companies. We base our model on their effectiveness with Drucker's 5 key principles: customer satisfaction, employee engagement and development, innovation, corporate social responsibility, and financial strength. 250 of those companies are highlighted in the Wall Street Journal each December. There are many great stories behind the data. Our goal of this podcast is to hear those stories directly from leaders of America's best managed companies and about the significance of their work contributing to a well-functioning society. Doing the Right Things Well is made possible by Claremont Graduate University, the Drucker School of Management, and the Charles Koch Foundation. To learn more about the Drucker Institute, please visit us at druckerinstitute.com. All right, I'm really excited. Today, I get to talk with a new friend, Dr. Angela Jackson. And I think about the term, she's a Renaissance woman, right? When you think about it, you look at her background and look what she does every day. She's an entrepreneur. She's a researcher. She's an author, as you'll see this book that we'll talk about, The Win-Win Workplace. She's a teacher, a mentor, a mom, a partner, and all these other exciting things. But what I've truly appreciated since meeting her, it's the whole person that she is. She has purpose. She has drive. She has motivation, not just for herself, not just, I noticed from the people around her in her network, but for others that she ultimately is going to run into, probably meet at some point in life. Or somebody that learns from her is going to go teach somebody else. There's something really cool and fascinating about that. So it's just like when you think about the premise of this podcast is doing the right things well, this individual is doing the right things well, multiple things really well. So today's episode is a special episode. As you know, we know that the Drucker Institute has our annual rankings on corporate effectiveness. We've been talking to executives, but we thought it'd be really good to have Dr. Jackson on to kind of give a broader perspective of all these companies.
Michael, thank you so much for having me. And like I said, I love this title, A Renaissance Woman, and partly because it's all of these parts of myself that I bring to this work and this research around work. And the research that I'm doing around what does it mean to thrive at work, and how does that help businesses actually improve their bottom lines when they have a workforce that is thriving and growing and able to bring all sides of them to bear to work on behalf of the company.
I love it. And so when we talk about, you've got the introduction to the rankings themselves, right? I was on with an executive the other day from a company. It was interesting. They said, companies are really bad at communicating on what matters. So I'd like to think and we're dealing with human beings after all, right? Drucker talks about the organ of these companies are human beings, the managers.
That's exactly right. And what's so interesting, in writing the book, The Win-Win Workplace, and the research I've done, I've talked to leaders at over 1,700 companies. And I have to tell you, Michael, there's never been a time where I walked in and talked to a leader and said that leader said that they didn't care about their staff. And in fact, most of them will tell you how much money that they're spending and investments they're making into their teams. And what's fascinating is that when U.S. workers are surveyed, over 60% of them say that their employer doesn't care about them. And so one of my ahas in doing my research is that there is indeed a gap between what companies are doing and what leadership, the investments they're making, and what's actually being felt by the rank and file employee. And what I was hoping to do, and along with the research team, is that this research could actually help companies close the gap between their intended impact and how it's actually felt in the world of work. And that's how we came up with these 9 different strategies.
And what I like about it too, going back into this is, Tom Peters, we have his archives too. He just hammered humanism, right? So when we talk about corporate effectiveness, look, Drucker was big on innovation, right? He's big on you can't exist without a customer, understanding what the customer values, corporate social responsibility, what you do outside the walls of internal. Financial strength is not just profit, but profit to go another day, profit to be shared. And then the thing that we're really diving into is employee engagement and development. And if you look at the rankings this year, the quote that was picked up from my interview with the Wall Street Journal was talking about, yes, technology tends to dominate the top ranks and some other companies too. But we know like one of the significant things is back to employees. And the world we live is technology makes companies thrive, but not just for the sake of innovation. Back to this, what you're talking about is innovation to allow the employees to grow, to adapt. And companies seem to be treating them differently now, almost like a customer themselves. Happy employee, happy customer. We start some correlation on that, but I bet you have a lot more to tell on that one.
Absolutely. And I love that you double click because I think there is a narrative out there around tech is that they're leading because it's just a paycheck. But when we pulled under the hood and looked at tech companies, the paycheck definitely is a factor, but there were also some intangibles. So when we looked at Salesforce, we look at Microsoft, despite some of their kind of scores around leadership, you still see that their investments in well being, in social mobility, in terms of growth and career growth, they're always rated number one. And so, what does that mean? At Harvard, I teach a course on innovation. And part of innovative and coming out with any idea is to have a team that feels like they're one, psychologically safe, two, that they're being invested in. These are some of kind of the prerequisites to have innovation in place. And so when we look at basic needs, right, when an employee has that taken care of, they feel like they're safe, they're being invested in, that they're growing, that opens up the aperture for them to begin to experiment, to think about what I write in the book called an ownership mindset, right? So that they're investing and they're working on behalf of a company they feel is truly fully invested in them. And that's where we see some of the highest engagement.
And it makes me think about the other Drucker thing. The most misquote, biggest misquote of Drucker is culture eats strategy for breakfast. That was supposedly out of an MIT professor. You can all see it on the website. And we're going to make sure that we're getting the right quotes out there in this world, particularly with AI. But kind of going back into what we found in our research is, right, there's multiple ingredients that make a company successful when it comes to this employee development engagement. Different things and some of the things that you mentioned. And I think that's the important part is because going back to if companies are human beings, they're personalities too. And personalities is of what you've hired them to do is their task, which is their culture. And it persists. And I think that's like a fascinating thread to pull down because a lot of this, it's so personal. I mean, so with all the research you've done, like, do you think about it that way? Do you think about companies and their personalities and all the mixed ingredients and who's thriving and not?
We have to look at them as personalities. And one thing, I also, in addition to advising, Fortune 500 companies, I work with a set of startup companies. And one thing I say to those founders is whether you're intentional or not, you're going to have a culture. Your organization is going to have a personality. And when we think about startup organizations, one thing that they have kind of in their toolbox is that they are new and they can be intentional about the ways that they want to work. I'm thinking about one of the companies that's topping your list, HubSpot. When we look at the CEO of HubSpot, she's very forthright about her own personal story, growing up in India where, she, wasn't allowed to go to school until, later in age and, going to school with no shoes on. But she talks about the role of work in one's life. And one thing she also really understands and talks about, Yamini, is making sure that people have the structures around them, right, that make work possible. And I want to just harken back to the pandemic just briefly. we saw, in mass, and this is one of the benefits of the pandemic, that, there are certain things that everyone needs to be in a mindset and an ability and have the capacity to work. You need to be healthy, right? You need to make sure if you're parents that you have adequate childcare and transportation. And so what we're seeing is that more leaders, and I look at, Yamini and look at her work at HubSpot, who are really embodying that deep understanding and that lived experience around what does it take for my workforce to be there, to show up, to invest fully in the job, and what can we, and what is the role of the employer to be able to take care of some of that. And I say, back in the day, we had the zero sum workplace where everything personal, you checked it at the door. At least you were supposed to check it at the door and put your head down. And we see that that's not the case anymore, right? And even if people don't talk about it, it's still present. And we have some of the most forward-thinking leaders that we've seen on your list, also that I write about in the book, who are really acknowledging this truth that we need to make sure that basic needs of employees are taken care of so they can come in, be engaged, and innovate on behalf of the company.
The mission of the company, the production of a product, the service and all that, that tends to be easy. It's managing people that we seem to still have all this knowledge in all these institutions and within companies too, that sometimes there seems to be a fumbling or a misconnection of those learning processes. And then if you're successful, you become a manager or leader, but it's based on kind of what you found, what made work for you, back to that personality. Is that's what I find interesting about your work is like, you're like trying to help people wisdoms over time, like learn best practices to get there.
That's exactly it. And what we saw in the research, this is very fascinating, Michael. You bring this up. Most people are promoted to manager because they're a great, individual contributor, right? And so they've done the best they can. They've learned maybe from some folks who have managed them. And what happens is that we promote these individual contributors, or we promote someone from manager, outside the organization, but really not understanding that the style of management is also about the culture of the company. And if we think about, we want certifications and degrees and other skills, but we're not asking someone to certify in their ability to actually manage. And one thing I saw when I was doing the writing of the book was that companies who I called more of win-win workplaces, they actually took the step and started to train people who they promoted to manager. This seems like a no-brainer, but to find out how many companies do not actually do this. So, imagine, what does it mean to be a manager at Adobe? Adobe is one of those companies that really lays out very clearly, actually does that type of management training. So what does it mean to be a manager at Adobe? That might be very different than what it means to be a manager at Microsoft or another one of their peers or competitors. But what we're seeing with these win-win companies are they're taking this really seriously. When companies say people are the most valuable resource, I say, show me your balance sheet. How are you investing in actual training and development? How are you building what I write about in the book is a deep talent bench, not just trying to go out and buy the best talent. How actually are you building your own talent? Because when we know that companies do this, that their employees stay longer, they have higher engagement and they have higher psychological safety, which sets up the conditions, right, for the tough times, people will lean in, and then some of the best times, some of the innovation that we'll see.
What companies have you found that still a CEO, even though they're kind of in a bubble now, they still are a great role model, walking the line, living the values, showing the behaviors of what leadership, what management is, and what this company really aspires to do? Have you seen some of that? And like they're able to maintain that connection, even though they're kind of being pushed into a disconnect?
Absolutely. So, there's one leader that just popped in my mind, Joe Campanelli. He's the president CEO of Needham Bank. And what's so interesting, late last year, the company went public, the bank went public. And they're based in Massachusetts, Needham, Massachusetts. And the entire company was going to take a bus to New York to ring the NASDAQ bell. And the CEO, Joe, again, had access to a private jet, could have flown in. He actually jumped on one of those tour buses and made the trek from Massachusetts into New York City, 4 hours of traffic, 5 hours. And what I'd say to that is, one thing I've seen him do and what that exemplifies is how do you flatten the lived experience of these hierarchies? As I write about in the book, there's always going to be hierarchies in companies, but what are leaders doing to actively actually make sure that they have their finger on the pulse of what's going on? So that was exemplified by Joe getting on the bus and showing that he's working shoulder to shoulder, having conversation. He rode there with them, and then he rode all the way back with them. But we saw this time and time again with a lot of the CEOs in these win-win workplaces. They would go out of their way to do small things. For example, I write about one CEO of an advanced manufacturing company. He still sends handwritten birthday cards to his direct reports, and he encourages them to do the same thing for their direct reports. Again, it's the signals that we see these CEOs are giving that actually says, I have an open door policy, putting their email on the website and making sure a commitment that they get back to people in 24 and 36 hours. So it can be done. It just takes some will and actually openness to do it.
Yeah, and it's that sincerity, authenticity, right? If you believe somebody's being sincere, authentic, and transparent in what they're doing or saying and in those actions, that goes so far in building the trust and driving
It
culture.
It does go so far, and that's the big thing that we think about in relationships. So in the past, when I talk about the old way of work, there was this contract of, if you do your job, you get a paycheck, and if things keep going along, you can, work here and retire here. I think about my own grandfather who started American Motors, 30, 40 years later, he's retiring from there. We know that that doesn't exist anymore. And so typically when employees that we're seeing that are going into engagement, it's like we're earning in with each other real time at every decision that we're making as a corporate leader, every policy, every practice. Are we moving forward, having more trust? Or are we going backwards? And we see that a lot with a lot of the conversations around the return to office, or we have changing policies around DEI. We have political headwinds. And so one thing that we've seen with leaders in these win-win workplaces is that they have really used that pillar one of centering employee voice and over communicating. They've done that really well. They talk about, and I'll give you an example. There was one research firm who they received 80% of their, funding from the federal government. And so they received a mandate that they had to do away with DEI. And personally, the head of HR didn't agree with this, but they had a choice to be made. Either they could stand on this kind of mode of DEI and lose their funding and have to let people go, or they could think about evolving some of their practices. And so what the CHRO did was, and the president is, they actually did a town hall and shared and brought every employee into their thinking and said, this is the decision that we have to make. If we lose 80% of this funding, we're going to have to lay off significant people. We can think about how we reimagine our practices and still keep the core, or we can, reimagine our practices and still keep the core. And when we went in, as we talked to rank and file employees after this was that kind of announcement was given, one thing I heard over and over again is that even when employees didn't agree, they said that they understood and they felt appreciative to be brought into the thinking. And so what happened out of this is, while many companies are having fractures under return to office, what we're seeing in this instance is a coming together. I'm saying, we're all in this. We believe in the work of the company. We believe people should be inclusive. We're still going to practice that, right? And team and culture is more important than ever, but we're all in this together. So that's just one example of how do you put these principles in play, especially and even so when it's really hard to do.
The challenge of our lifetime, going back from 100 years ago, we seem to resolve it with FDR and first Teddy Roosevelt and trust and other things, is the path of equity. And I mean, equity is equity to actually own something in our lives, own an idea, not just a house and stock and all that stuff, but own an idea in the skill sets, whether you want to call them soft or hard skill sets, whatever they are, to be able to first really, this ties into your personal journey a little too, is one on the business of businesses and how they allocate resources and they empower people. In your journey, you talked about your grandfather, you talked about your accident. Some of the things you can kind of say is how do we help people
For me, it makes the employer's role ever the more important. When I began researching this book, what was fascinating for it, and you talked about my own personal story, is that, we spend over a third of our lives at work, even more so if we look at our waking hours. And for me, when the beginning of my career, and I write about this in the book, I had a corporate job, was working for Nokia Viacom. My life was like up in the air, a million miler on multiple airlines, etc. And then I end up getting into a terrible car crash. And in that moment, my busyness stopped. And I remember I was in physical therapy for, 6 months. I hadn't seen my family. And I remember laying on my couch, in excruciating pain, but thinking, what is this all for? And in that moment, after working, regularly 10, 15-hour days, weekends, traveling, I thought, what is this all about? What is this purpose about? And we saw that happen with a lot of people during the pandemic when we watched, from home and we saw loved ones pass away. People are like, what is this about life? And as I go around with my researchers and we're surveying more and more, US residents, working adults, they're trying to figure out what this purpose is. And what I get excited about when I have these conversations is work is that place that we all come together despite, backgrounds, differences, politics, etc. Imagine if that's the place where people feel like they can actually grow and thrive. And that's really meeting the moment. When you look at most US residents, the place that they think that they're going to learn a new skill is going to be at work. The folks that they trust more than government and higher institutions of higher learning are corporations. And so what happens in these places where corporations are stepping in and saying, we're going to actually invest in our people in different ways because we know that they're the competitive advantage that we have against our peers in competition when we're working aligned and in sync.
I want to talk a little more about the personal journey, especially early on, because I like it, as a parent. I know you're a parent, and it's like the idea of, asking the question at career day the other day, as I said, who would rather be the smartest kid in the class or the most motivated? And out of like the 35 kids in the class, one kid raised his hand about being the smartest. Everybody else understood the power of motivation. And it kind of like, I think that's a fascinating thing. And going back into like something internally or externally like motivated you.
No, and I think for me, in terms of motivation and others, my motivation behind my research, and I've shared this, is my grandfather, to see that time when there's a social contract. And it not just him, but his peers. I grew up in this factory town where people had dignity in work. Someone could work a blue collar job and they could still send their kids off to college to have that American dream. And so really fast forward thinking about what does that dream look like today? And how is that being enabled today when we think about the world of work, we think about the cost of education and how, when things are going right, that you can actually learn and advance on the job. And so the question you ask is, what is your motivation to do that? I think when you go through and you're learning a new skill, and when we talk to people, the motivation is understanding that what you do actually matters. And so that's where, again, direct managers and employers, companies, they actually give people that opportunity to know what they do and why it can actually matter. It can actually be measured there. So imagine, all of this investments in actual people, knowing that they matter to the longevity and to the financial well-being of the company. How can we unlock and use that as an unlock and like a force multiplier?
What people tend to forget, and sometimes if companies aren't structured correctly or well, and this happens in higher ed too, is right, it gets in, Drucker is big about empowering people, but them understanding their contribution to that larger mission of the organization. But it's this part that's really different that I feel like some people unfortunately haven't figured it out yet. We have to figure out a way is measuring results, not activities.
And what are the opportunities? When we think about what folks are being faced with right now, and the reason why I keep coming about this entity of work, what if you can go to your job and you can be able to advance there? We're seeing more and more companies think about education as a benefit. I think about the work of Guild Education and the different partners that partner with them. You've got, retail stores such as Macy's saying you can actually skill up and get a degree while you're working on the job. I think about the work that's coming out of craft education at Western Governors University of saying this whole idea of apprenticeship degree. So in this new world of work where technology is transferring and actually changing right before our eyes, where do you go to learn a new skill? How do you do so when you're working full time and providing for your family? Where is the entity that actually can do that? And what we're seeing is some promise there when you think about it. But I would just push Michael of the wisdom comes when you're allowed. A lot of times when we look at entry level jobs today, hourly jobs, sometimes people are just going in, they're just doing one job and they're just asked to do that one job well. They're not given the latitude, right, to actually experiment, to try something new, to cross train. What we're seeing in these win-win workplace companies is that, companies are actually thinking about how are you doing more with less employees, but how are we deepening the experience of the employees that we have? I think a lot about Google. They're 20% off and saying, look, if you see a problem, a practice, or an idea that you want to innovate on, we're actually building time in for you to actually do that. I think Royal Bank Canada, that's been on some list, they're very deep on cross training, and they felt that work actually helps to build relationships and for people and empathy. So people actually understand. And so we actually see that teaming. So people are still growing and learning, but they're also getting to know each other and their colleagues as people behind just you're the marketing department or you're the HR department or you're a business unit.
Because it is because we live in a world in which specialization is really rewarded, right? If you're a great coder, a great screenwriter, like, you've come up with an idea that's going to solve the world's problems or something like that. But not everybody has, right? Not everybody has that aha moment.
Yeah, and how do you do that? One story I'm inspired by, and I've written about them a bit, is Intel Corporation. And so, for example, they went to rural Ohio and they opened, a new kind of advanced, they're opening a new advanced manufacturing plant there, a fab plant there. And one thing that they realized, and we have to give credit to their former CEO, was that when they go into a community, it's rural, they do a survey of the schools, K through 12 schools. They look at the community colleges, they look at the high school, because they know that they're going to have to build a local pipeline of talent. And going out and flying people to Columbus to live just to work for Intel, that doesn't work because people don't stay. What they have seen pattern over decades now is that when they open new fab, if they can build a bench of local talent, that people, they have higher retention, right? They have higher engagement. People want to stay and they want to grow because lots of people actually want to stay in their hometowns. And one thing that they've done is starting with some of the earliest grades, they've had, Intel employees out in the schools. They have them, they're experts working with high school, teachers on the curriculum, working with the community college, and really thinking about their role in the community. And one thing I'll say that they've told me, Michael, is they're like, we don't do this out of charity. We know that we're going to need thousands of engineers that currently don't exist in Ohio. And we know that when this, fabrication opens up in 2031, we need to have a pipeline of talent. So we need to start working today. And one of their, head of government relations said, he's like, we don't do this out of charity. This is actually a business problem. And so we're seeing more and more retailers and employers really think about how do we build our own talent bench versus looking without. And if we look at, the current, things that are going on in the world today, that type of build your own strategy is going to become even more important in coming weeks, months, and years.
So thinking about your book is right. It's a big endeavor to write a book. You've had all your experiences, all the knowledge and all that stuff, and you wanted to share something with the world. Were you, during the process, whatever length of time that it took you, did you kind of probe and test and kind of try to validate some of your hypotheses and other things that you had learned. And did you discover at some point in that process somebody pushed back on you, or you had a more of an aha moment of you might have had everything, a linear fashion of chapters and stuff, but something changed. You're like, I really didn't think about it that way, or wow, this is the gold nugget that I really need to go further on.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so, for me, my research has been going on for over a decade now, and the book was a way to like actually take it out of academia and put in the hands of actual practitioners who can make change in their workplaces. As I was doing this work, one thing I believe that I had underestimated was the importance of really making the economic case. And so, one of the last chapters, what I did was I pulled from some of the guidance where we saw win win workplaces, where we had CFOs that were in these companies who are actually measuring the investments of talent and really trying to do the art and science of saying, and what's that impact on our share price? What's that impact on sales, on productivity? And what I found out is that even though we are trying to make it more of a science, that at the end of the day, it is more of an art and science. And so, one of the areas I got pushback on there was, how do you actually measure the investments in people and doing it in a way that just honors people? That's not just for the sake of counting and saying it all has to be around financial, outcomes. And I appreciated that because that made me think about that a bit more. And what I came to, Michael, and I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this too, is that there are certain companies that are investing in people because they feel like it's the right thing to do. It's the moral thing to do. It's something that they've always done. And then there's this other set of people who want to do this, but we live in a capitalistic society, right? There's market pressures. And so the idea is, even when the economic headwinds are hard, how do we still keep and maintain these investments in people? And that's where this economic argument came from. And so my full disclosure is that it's not easy or exact to actually measure this, but what we've seen in certain companies is the closer that they get to having a number and actually communicating the impact of these investments, the more sustainable that they've been. And so I agree with some of the pushback, and I still say it's worth the exercise in trying to figure out this economic case so that we're not making cuts to people when we should maybe be making investments in people, to actually get to that like ideal state and get to profitability.
Samuel Johnson said most people have to be not educated but reminded. And this is kind of like that little reminding phase of all the things that you've accumulated, the knowledge and wisdom and all that stuff over time. Hearing these Drucker things again, like what are the three things that really jump out to you that it said, these are the things that hit me over the head when I was younger, when I was moving along my career, and now as I'm reflecting a little and writing and sharing my knowledge?
I think the biggest thing, and this is a piece of advice I got from a great professor, Deborah Jewel Sherman at Harvard University. And one thing that she says, which I think is really great, is the time to make friends is before you need them. And one thing that I like about that is that, and that goes back to our whole conversation, that when you're in relationship with people, people understand what you mean to them and that they matter to you. These are the people who go the extra mile for you in your relationships, in the world of work. If they're reporting to you, they're the people who you go the extra mile with in the workplace too, which I think is really, really, really important when we think about that. And then I go back to what you said is the purpose of an organization is to help ordinary people do extraordinary things. What When I think about Drucker's principle of that, I think about the possibilities of work, the genius, the people that we hire in, the hopes and dreams when they come into workplaces, what they're expecting. No one's being hired thinking they're going to be fired or they're not going to perform. There's a lot of good energy and goodwill there. How do we continue to like tap into that? How do we grow that? And how do we measure that in terms of the success of the organization? So when we think about the KPIs at a board meeting, we're talking about, productivity, we're talking about sales, we're talking about service. How are we still talking about those same human principles at the end of the day?
Is there anything like a life lesson for yourself that you maybe went a little sidetracked on one of the, when you think about the principles of your own stuff and you're like, you had your own haha moment from somebody that reported to you or a student and all that stuff, like they actually felt empowered enough to say, I think there's a little miscommunication here or something interesting.
Yeah, I think there's two things that come to mind. The first was, and I read about this in the book. I was one of those people who was promoted to manager because I was a great individual contributor. You know, I was type A. I like to come in before the boss got in. I'd stay late. And I remember I had a direct report that was a bit older than me. I was in my 20s at the time. And, you know, she kept leaving early. And I was just so frustrated because we had, you know, projects to be done. There were deadlines. And finally, you know, I pulled her in the office again and I said, you know, what is going on? You keep, you know, leaving early. Sometimes you come in late. And, you know, I was just giving her, you know, just kind of like, you've got to shape up. We've got to do better than this. And then finally she just turns to me. She goes, Angela, I'm going through a divorce, you know, and I have to be there to pick my daughter up at a bus when she gets off. You know, she's in third grade. And I stopped in that moment. My own ahas. One is, I would have, if you would have asked me, I would have told you that I was an empathetic leader. I was just stunned because, like, how did I miss that my direct report was going through something that was so meaningful to her? And I had missed it because I was so focused on work and, you know, all of the deliverables, et cetera. But it taught me in that moment a very valuable lesson, right? That as a manager, it's not only what people tell us, you know, we're not mind reading readers, but to make sure that we're opening up space for people to actually be human. And so for her, we were able to mend our relationship and move forward. And it was just one of those life lessons for me in terms of being a manager myself.
I like to have a little fun at the end. My thing I've asked is, I just did it in my first one. I was like, oh, that's pretty clever. And in a fun way, not in a kind of like, aha, bragging moment is, in a year from now, what's your I told yourself moment?
Ooh, I love it. So right now, my I told yourself moment is looking back. I am been on the road, you know, 20 cities already, promoting this book. And one thing that I tried to tell myself, which, you know, I'll be looking back a year from now, is that I'm hoping that I'll collect stories of people who are actually making this change. And I'm starting to hear some of those stories now about people who are trying and doing things differently. A year from now, the told you so would be like, you were right. You collected the stories. You got some exemplars to share. Because I honestly, with all of the headwinds that we see and news headlines, one thing I'd love to leave your listeners with is that there's still a lot of good that's happening. We see the companies that are on your list. There are companies who are doubling down on their people practices or who are not being swayed by the headlines, who are, you know, looking at investments in their people. And we need to keep sharing these exemplars, right? Because that gives social license to other companies, to other leaders to actually consider and engage in these practices.
Yeah, and that's the great end note, right? At the end of the day, it's being optimistic. You think about rights that we have, and we think about democracy as Coretta Scott King. Democracy is something you fight for every day, regardless of the pressures. It requires courage. And Drucker would say, managing with courage. And so I think on that end, I knew this was going to be a great conversation. You know, I chatted a bunch of times. I don't think we have any problem of going back and forth with questions for each other out of, you know, being curious. But yes, there's so much good in the world. Dr. Angela Jackson in her work represents that good. And it's good not for the sake of just being good, right? But the sake of, once again, making the world a better place. So I really appreciate you taking this time to have this conversation. And hopefully, I'd like to think that as people listen to it, pick up your book or think about their own lives and making the world a better place, that we're all going to be better off for it. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Michael.
We thank you for listening to Doing the Right Things Well podcast. We'd also like to thank the Charles Koch Foundation for its generous funding to help make this podcast possible. The Charles Koch Foundation works to ensure all people have the opportunity to live a life of meaning and contribution based on their unique gifts and aptitudes. They do this by investing in the social entrepreneurs who can transform the institutions most responsible for lifelong learning, post-secondary education, and business, and empowering people to engage in work that benefits everyone. To learn more about the Charles Koch Foundation, please visit charleskochfoundation.org. That's Charles, Koch Foundation.org. Please do subscribe to the Drucker Institute's YouTube, Spotify, and Apple podcast channels to listen to more episodes in this series.